Good evening. I'm Dan Weiser, the founder and artistic director of AmiciMusic. I want to welcome you to the final of our Piano Favorites live stream. Again, a huge thank you to Sally Sparks at Streamside Music for producing this show and the whole Keep Music Live project that she's a part of. She's also a part of the Asheville Music School. You saw the video there. It's a wonderful organization that brings music to young people and older people in the Asheville area. So great if you can help them. I actually helped do a benefit concert for them last week, and they were raising over $6,000. So it's a great program, and I'm really happy to be here. I'm happy to have all of you join me, and thank you for being on the long ride here. 5 shows we've done. I could probably go on for 5 more, but I think I should cut it off now. And my hope is that we'll probably do some individual concerts in July, maybe a piano composer and some Gershwin, maybe some ragtime. So I'll keep you informed as we go along. We will end it tonight. And those of you who have followed all 5 sessions, we sort of started in Vienna. And that's where the first center of music was, with Mozart and Beethoven in the end of the 1700s, early 1800s. Then we moved to Germany with the music of Schumann and Mendelssohn, with also a little bit in France at the time with Chopin, but really Germany and then Vienna still were the centers. Last session, we moved over to Russia, which very quickly became a hotbed of great music in the middle of the 19th century after the conservatories started there, and with the music of Tchaikovsky and Rachmaninoff. But today we're going to start off in Paris, which really became the center of music at the end of the 19th century, the last 10 or 15 years and into the 20th century. And then we're going to end in America, which then became the center when jazz, ragtime, and the blues came. And also then when all of the composers fled Europe during World War II and the years before that, many of them coming to Hollywood to live there. So it's a great journey. In the middle, we're also going to hear some great Spanish composers who spent a lot of time in Paris, but brought their national music with them. I wanted to begin, though, with really one of the great composers of all time, Claude Debussy. And really, we owe it to him for changing a lot about music. There would really maybe not be all of the crazy 20th century music without Claude Debussy. And even though we listen to his music and it seems so beautiful and not really that modern sounding, he opened up so many doors with his thinking about what music could be. And he didn't want to follow some of the old stale ideas about music. Much the same as the Impressionist painters, when we look at their paintings, they don't look all that radical, but they opened up new ideas about what a painting was. It didn't have to be about anything. It could just be about light and color. And often that's what Debussy's music is doing as well. He was born in 1862 and was one of the youngest people to enter the Paris Conservatory when he was 10 years old. A seriously talented kid, a great pianist, but he was also very opinionated, very argumentative, and rather experimental. And in his early works, he wanted to play around with dissonant chords. He didn't always want to follow the rules of composing. This got him into some trouble at the conservatory. He got some bad marks, even though they all said he was the most talented. But as he once said, "I love music passionately, and because I love it, I must free it from the barren traditions that stifle it." He also said, "Some people wish above all to conform to the rules. I wish only to render what I can hear. There is no theory. You only have to listen. Pleasure is the law." So once that opens up the door that if you don't have to follow the rules, anything could happen. And some people say that's what happened to 20th century music. It went a little crazy. Debussy actually spent his years of when he was 18, 19, and 20 in Russia, hanging out with Nadezhda von Meck and her family. Those of you who heard me talk about Tchaikovsky, that was the woman who was the patron of Tchaikovsky, although would not let Tchaikovsky ever meet her. So Debussy was hanging out there as a kind of piano teacher to her children, and he actually even wrote a four-hand piano version of Swan Lake by Tchaikovsky while he was there. He then gets back to Paris, and he actually sees Tristan and Isolde by Wagner in 1887. And he loved it. He said it was the finest thing I had ever heard. And many French composers fell under the sway of Wagner and this kind of lush harmonies that seemed to sort of have lots of dissonances in them. But as Debussy sort of perceptively said, he said, Wagner was a beautiful sunset that was mistaken for a dawn. He thought there was a dead end with where Wagner was going, and he wanted to open up new chords, new scales. And so he began to write some very, very beautiful music. I want to start off with his first Arabesque that he writes in 1888. You may have heard this before. It has a sort of feeling like waterfalls and outdoor nature. Here is the Arabesque by Debussy. just a beautifully delicate music of Claude Debussy. Debussy loved nature imagery, and he said, "Music is the expression of the movement of the waters, the play of the curves described by changing breezes." And he also once famously said, "Music is the silence between the notes." And that is so important for Debussy, that so much of what happens is not the actual notes, but the things between the notes, those moments of color. And he really expanded what the piano could do. He thought of Chopin as the greatest composer because everything he did was on the piano. And Debussy added to the color an effect that he could do as well. Now, his personal life was rather interesting. He married a woman named Lily Texier, a fashion model, in 1899. But she was rather intellectually limited, as he said, and not very musical. Didn't really care much about his career. And so he had a couple different affairs. The most famous one was with Emma Bardock, who was a well-known singer, the wife of a wealthy banker. And I mentioned last week that Gabriel Fauré was in love with Emma Bardock, and his famous Dolly suite was actually written for her daughter, Dolly, that she had with the banker. And Fauré sort of wanted to run off with Emma Bardock as well. She didn't do that, but she did run off with Debussy in 1904, had a rather scandalous affair, and caused more scandal because the first wife, Texier, shot herself in the chest while standing in the Place de la Concorde in Paris. The bullet remained lodged in her vertebrae until her death in 1932. But Debussy left her, ended up getting married to Emma Bardock. They had one daughter together, she would die in 1919. He dedicated his wonderful Children's Corner suite to her. He would ultimately die during World War I, and actually his funeral procession was during a major bombardment of Paris by the Germans. One interesting side note, he actually in 1916 underwent one of the first colostomy operations ever performed, but he would die of rectal cancer a couple years later. He also had a wonderful quote about opera. He did write one opera, Pelléas and Melisande, which was not hugely successful, largely because it's not a lot of singing. There's a lot more orchestra in it. But as he said, in opera, there is always far too much singing. And he certainly followed that. And I wanted to read one last quote before I play his beautiful Clair de Lune. This is Debussy in a 1911 interview talking about nature. He said, "I have made mysterious nature my religion. When I gaze at a sunset sky and spend hours contemplating its marvelous, ever-changing beauty, an extraordinary emotion overwhelms me. Nature, in all its vastness, is truthfully reflected in my sincere, though feeble soul. Around me are the trees stretching up their branches to the skies, the perfumed flowers gladdening the meadow, the gentle grass-carpeted earth, and my hands unconsciously assume an attitude of adoration." So we adore Debussy's music. This is his very famous Clair de Lune. This is from the Suite Bergamasque, which he actually started composing in 1890, but he kind of revises it all and he republishes it in 1905. Clair de Lune meaning moonlight, and this is based upon the poetry of Paul Verlaine, who had this wonderful imagery and of course about the nature and how you can have dappled lights and reflections of light. Here's Clair de Lune by Claude Debussy. beautiful Clair de Lune by Debussy. All right, we're now going to move to another French composer who I love. In fact, I actually wrote part of my dissertation on him, if you can see my giant tome, and that is the Erik Satie, wonderfully bizarre, iconoclastic composer who was actually friends with Debussy. They were at conservatory together briefly, but not unlike Debussy, Satie was not much of a student. In fact, his report cards at the conservatory, he was described as insignificant and laborious, worthless, and the laziest student in the conservatory. He was born in 1866, and after he sort of leaves the conservatory, he begins to do some crazy things. Stravinsky, the composer, said that Satie was the oddest person he had ever known, but at the same time, the most rare and constantly witty. And the crazy thing about Satie, he was friends with all of the great artists in Paris at the 20th century. He and Picasso did a ballet together, Parade, but he knew everybody, the writers and the poets, all the way from the Dadaists to the Surrealists to the Cubists, and he was in with all of them. He had just so many ideas, not necessarily about music. He really saw music as part of a larger spectrum of the arts. And in fact, he wanted to find ways to make music more like art. One of his great quotes, he said, he really hated Wagner and most German music. He says, "It is necessary for us to have a music of our own, with no sauerkraut, if possible. Why not make use of the descriptive approach that Monet, Cézanne, and Toulouse-Lautrec are showing us? Why not transpose this approach into music?" And he elaborated that further. He said, this he wrote to Debussy. They had a long correspondence together. He said, "Believe me, we have enough of Wagner. It's quite beautiful, but not of our stock. We should see to it that the orchestra does not grimace when characters enter on the scene. Look here, do the trees of the scenery grimace? We should make a musical scenery, create a musical climate where the personages move and speak, not in couplets, not in leitmotifs, but by the use of a certain atmosphere of Puvis de Chavannes." Puvis de Chavannes was a weird artist as well who did these kind of flat paintings, often of white angels and nymphs. And that's what Satie's music is. It's very flat and does not try to develop. Music had always been about developing, going from one place to the next. For Satie, it was just sort of this flatness, like a painting, like you just see, and it just exists and sort of resonates within us. He had a good friend, Contamine de la Tour, who described the technical issues that Satie had. Satie didn't really learn that much at the conservatory, so he didn't have great skills as to write these large-scale pieces. And Latour said, "Satie was a man who knew only 13 letters of the alphabet, but who had nevertheless decided to create a new literature with only these means rather than admit his deficiency." So I want to start off with one of his great works. This is the Gymnopedie. He writes that in 1887. You've heard this many times. It's probably the most often used music in movies. But at the time when this came out, nobody understood what it was all about. It was just flat, repetitive music, and he was laughed at, except by Debussy, who loved this piece and actually orchestrated it 10 years later. There are 3 Gymnopédies altogether. Here's the first Gymnopédie. And it's just a flatness and a solitariness about that piece, which really captures that whole end of the 19th century kind of ennui and the absinthe there in Paris, that cabaret, cafe culture. And in fact, Satie was part of that culture. He joined the Chat Noir, the famous cabaret there, as the cabaret pianist. And I'll play a little bit in a second, one of his cabaret pieces. But that's where Debussy hung out. And he began, Satie did, to put some of that cabaret style into his music, combining the kind of the low forms and the high forms in a really fascinating way. He actually founded his own church at some point, of which he was the only member. He called it the Metropolitan Church of the Art of Jesus the Conductor. Very anti-establishment, a kind of a Dada before Dada even existed. And in fact, he was not, I guess I say, not well known during most of his life, but then gets rediscovered later on, about 1910, 1911, by Ravel, who we'll hear later on, and these young group of composers who saw him suddenly as a kind of a precursor, a John the Baptist figure who understood where music was heading and tried to take out a lot of the extraneous stuff that was ruining music. Satie's also famous for inventing what we call muzak. He called it furniture music. He once went to, there was an art exhibit, and he had music playing at the exhibit, and he purposely told people, don't listen to the music. Walk around, the music is part of the background. We expect that now, but at the time, people were shocked. Normally, if you listen to music, you're supposed to actually listen to it. But Satie sort of recognized where music was headed. And he had lots of strange titles for his music. Desiccated Embryos, one of the pieces was called. And there's a famous story where Debussy told him that he needed to maybe have a little bit more form to his music. So he submitted to him 3 pieces in the form of a pear, which had nothing to do with anything, but again shows his crazy sense of humor. And I want to play next a piece of his called the Gnossienne. All of these titles are made up. Satie loved words. So Gymnopedie was his own word. Gnossienne is his own word. Although they certainly have ideas of Greek stories and old epic times. I don't know if any of you can see this Gnossienne. What's fascinating about it, there are no bar lines in this piece. It's one of the first pieces that gets rid of bar lines. Satie thought it sort of got in the way. He didn't need bar lines. And he's right. You can play this piece without it. They usually sort of help you keep a beat, but there's no reason for him. He also added little words in this in French just for the performer to read. One of them says, advise yourself wisely. Another one says, you are very lost. And then one at the end says, open your head. Again, nonsense stuff just for our own purposes. You'll probably recognize this one. This is the Gnossienne from 1890. And that's it. It just sort of fades away. There's not really any end to Satie's music. You could sort of repeat it endlessly. And in fact, he did have a couple pieces where he wrote at the top, repeat this. One of them, he said, repeat this 840 times, but really take a lot of time to think about it. And there were some crazy people in the 1960s, especially, who did it 840 times, although it's crazy. So there is a sense in his music of just sort of coming in at the middle of something, and then you think the music's going to keep going, whether you're there or not. And I wanted to, he had went to one, oops, let me see this. I dropped all my stuff. Where did it go? Here we go. During the time he was in the cabaret, he wrote a wonderful piece called Je te veux, or I Want You, for a singer named Paulette Darty. And I wanted to play that, leaving Sati, the last piece. This really is a kind of great popular music. It really begins to head towards jazz and that French style. The words, one of the verses are, I have no regrets. I have only one desire. Beside you, they're so close. To live all my life. May my body be yours. May your lips be mine. May your heart be mine. And may all my flesh be yours. And one last quote before I play that piece. Virgil Thompson had a wonderful quote about Sati. He said, Sati's music mumbles no incantations. It is not designed to give little girls a thrill or to impress conductors or to get anybody a job teaching school. It has literally no deep motivation. It is as simple as a friendly conversation and in its better moments, exactly as poetic and profound. Here's Je te veux by Sati. So that's the wonderful Erik Satie. He has crazy stuff out there. I urge you to look him up a little bit. I loved writing about him. Just a fascinating character and a man who, as I say, was friends with Man Ray and Duchamp. He helped put together one of the first ready-mades in Paris. So just a really fascinating guy who connected all of the arts in a great way. All right, we're going to do one last French composer, and that's the wonderful Maurice Ravel. Ravel was, his father was actually a Swiss engineer. Where's my stuff here? Oh, everything's getting lost again. He had actually invented something called the whirlwind of death, which was an automotive loop-de-loop that was big in circuses in the early part of the 20th century until there was a fatal accident in 1903. But the father was a Swiss inventor. The mother was actually from Basque country in Spain. So he had this interesting combination of the meticulous Swiss and the more passionate Spanish. Stravinsky actually referred to him once as that most perfect of Swiss watchmakers. It took him years sometimes to write a piece. He was very meticulous. He didn't write a lot of music. And in fact, at one point he said about his style, he said, "In my own compositions, I judge a long period of conscious gestation necessary. During this interval, I come progressively and with growing precision to see the form and the evolution that the final work will take in its tonality. Thus, I can be occupied for several years with one piece without writing a single note of the work, after which composition goes relatively quickly. But one must spend much time in eliminating all that could be regarded as superfluous in order to realize as completely as possible the definitive clarity so much desired. The moment arrives when new conceptions must be formulated for the final composition, but they cannot be artificially forced, for they come only of their own accord, often deriving their original from some far-off perception and only manifesting themselves after many long years." So he really struggled with works, but the ones that he did are really quite fantastic. I think there's only 60 works altogether. And I'm going to play a very famous work of his called a Pavane for a dead princess, or Pavane pour un infante defunte, as it is in French. And in fact, the alliteration of the title really is what got him interested. And some people, he thinks, read too much into the piece. He said, "When I put together the words that make up this title, my only thought was the pleasure of alliteration." But he also was thinking artistically as well. If you know the painting by Velázquez, Las Meninas, of the little princess in that painting, he sort of wanted to evoke the 16th century pavanes and of a young princess, a lament, it's a evocation of this pavane that might have been danced by the princess in the painting. And in fact, he was always horrified about how slow some people played this piece. He said, "I wrote a pavane for a deceased princess, not a deceased pavane for a princess." So you have to be careful not to play it too slowly. We're going to hear about Ravel when we talk about Gershwin. There's a really fascinating connection between those two. Gershwin had come to Paris in 1926, and that's when he wrote American in Paris, and he had met Ravel there. And in fact, he wanted to study with Ravel because Ravel was a master orchestrator, and Gershwin thought he had a lot to learn about how to orchestrate. But Ravel didn't feel like he had anything to teach Gershwin. He thought he was already pretty darn good. By then, he had already written his Rhapsody in Blue. He said that, "I don't know if I should do this." And he supposedly said, "How much money do you make?" asking Gershwin. And when Gershwin told him, he said, "Maybe I should take lessons with you." He actually then encouraged him to study with Boulanger. He actually even wrote a letter to Boulanger, the great teacher, saying, "There is a musician in America endowed with the most brilliant, most enchanting, and most profound talent. His name is George Gershwin. His worldwide success no longer satisfies him. He knows that he lacks some technical means to achieve his goal. In teaching him these means, one might ruin his talent, though. Would you have the courage, which I wouldn't dare, to undertake this awesome responsibility?" And for her part, apparently, Boulanger said no. She basically said, "Why would you want to be a second-rate Ravel when you're already a first-rate Gershwin?" So Ravel loved Gershwin, and in fact, Ravel, then when he came back to America in 1928, and he celebrated his birthday while he was here, and when asked what he wanted for a present, he said, "I want Gershwin at my party." And apparently Gershwin did show up, and they spent time going to the Cotton Club and other places in Harlem. So it's a fun friendship between Ravel and Gershwin. This is an early work by Ravel. This dates to 1899, the Pavane for a Deceased Princess. Glorious music by Maurice Ravel. All right, so that's going to take us out of the French composers. So now I want to move to two different Spanish composers, Enrique Granados and Joaquin Turina. There was a sort of a movement of Spanish composers, Albéniz, De Falla, Granados, Turina, Mompou, who all wanted to get to Paris because that's where these new techniques and ideas, these impressionistic harmonies were there, and they wanted to use those, but then employ their own folk idiom. And I want to talk about Granados first, born in 1867. He dies in 1916 in a sort of terrible accident I'll talk about. He goes to Paris in 1887 and begins writing his fantastic Spanish music. And I want to start off right now with one of his very famous pieces. This is his Spanish dance, Andalusia, Opus 5, number 5, written in 1890, just after he gets to Paris. And you can really feel the Spanish bullfighting in that. That's so exciting. Here's Granados, Andalusia. Andalusia by Enrique Granados. Now, a few years later, he would write a piece called the Romantic Sea. this one last piece I'll play, the Epilogo, which is a very beautiful work. It sounds like movie music. For his own epilogue, Granados had written his most famous work, probably the Goyescas. Speaking of music relating to painting, these were all pieces based on paintings of Francisco Goya. They started off as piano pieces. He then turned it into an opera called Goyescas, which was supposed to get premiered in Europe, but World War I stopped it, and so it was actually premiered in America, in New York City, in 1916. So he comes to America for the premiere, and he has a trip back to Spain on a boat planned, but at the last minute, Woodrow Wilson, President Wilson, invites him to the White House to do a piano recital. Granados doesn't want to turn that down, so he goes down and does the recital. He ends up getting a different boat back, but it has to go through England. So he goes to England, but then on his way through across the English Channel, remember this is during World War I, his boat, the SS Sussex, is torpedoed by a German U-boat, and it sunk. Now, what's interesting is that the half of the boat survived, and it was half of the boat that Granados and his wife were on. But apparently they had decided to jump, and the wife, apparently, Amparo, was too heavy and could not get into a lifeboat, so he refused to leave her and positioned himself holding on to the raft. It's like a scene out of Titanic. And apparently they drowned as people watched them just when the rescuers came to save the boat. So a terrible, tragic end. They left behind 6 children, but wrote some fantastic music. I urge you to listen to Goyescas. It's beautiful. I want to play just this very short epilogo from his romantic scenes. Really seems like that's right out of some movie, but I can't place what that movie is. Lovely, lovely music. So that's a little Granados, and now a composer who's not nearly as famous, but I really love his music, and that's Joaquin Turina, born in Sevilla in 1882. He lives a pretty long life until 1949. Spends about 10 years in Paris from 1905 to 1914, where he got to know Debussy and Ravel, and then goes back and becomes the professor of composition at the Madrid Royal Conservatory. He described his music in this way. He said, "I want to sing of love and sadness, searching out that little corner of the Andalusian spirit that looks out to the wider world. I have lived part of my life dreaming, because I, as a musician, love melody. There, tragedy loses its heart-rending edge, dance becomes purer, and wine is only perfume. I cannot sit at the piano with a transcendental melody. I sing what pleases me, and I feel a response." Now, probably his reputation has suffered because when he was in Spain, he supported Franco. And some people sort of accuse him of getting his positions because of his connections to Franco. And after World War II, a lot of people turned against Turina because of that connection. But I do think that some of his music, he wrote a wonderful piano quartet and a few different piano trios. I'm going to play the three out of the Danzas gitanes. There are 5 of these altogether. Opus 55, written in 1929. They really have the kind of gypsy world of Granada in them. I'm going to play the number 1, Zambra, number 2, Dance of the Seduction, and number 5, Sacromonte. Here's a little music by Joaquin Turina. After this, I know you're all excited. My nephew Noah Teeny is going to perform. My 16-year-old nephew is going to perform some Joplin. I'll talk a little bit about it, and he'll play the Maple Leaf Rag, and then we're going to get close to finishing up as I move into some Gershwin. So first, here's Joaquin Turina. Awesome. I love that music. All right, great. So we are now heading over to America, and we're going to get Noah ready pretty soon here. I want to talk about the wonderful ragtime music of Scott Joplin. Really, ragtime became the first great American export, the first decade of the 20th century. It started playing everywhere, and it rose out of what was called the cakewalk, which was kind of a dance done by slaves to mock the owners. As one nanny wrote in 1901, us slaves used to watch the white folk parties where the guests danced a minuet and then paraded in a grand march, with the ladies and gentlemen going different ways and then meeting again, arm in arm, and marching down the center. Then we would do it too, but we used to mock them every step. Sometimes the white folks noticed it, but they seemed to like it. I guess they thought we couldn't dance any better. And that's where we get the expression, to take the cake, or a piece of cake, because the winner, the most sort of outlandish of these dancers, would get the piece of cake by the owner. But the syncopation of the cakewalk made its way into ragtime music, which really started off in the brothels and saloons, and it was an improvised music for the most part. They were incredible ragtime pianists who couldn't write down any of their music. They could just come up with something, and the next day would be a whole new thing, and it was just kind of this honky-tonk piano. But Scott Joplin was different. He was able to write down his music. He was born in 1868 in Texarkana. His father was a good violinist. His mother was a banjo player. The mother dies when he's 13, and then he sort of runs away from home in order to be a musician. And he starts playing around St. Louis at first and along all the Mississippi there, and eventually makes his way to Sedalia, Missouri. And that's where the Maple Leaf Club is. And it was a gentleman's club, one of these kind of saloons, and he started playing in that club. And that's where he wrote his first great rag, the Maple Leaf Rag. It has nothing to do with Canada. That was written at the Maple Leaf Club. And when he wrote it, he knew it was good. He told his friends, "This rag will make me the king of ragtime composers." And he was absolutely right. And so we'll give you a big sense of that. Please put your hands together and welcome my nephew, Noah Titi. He's doing this for charity for the Adirondack Wildlife Refuge, if you wanted to make a donation while he's playing to that cause. Here's Noah.
Awesome, Noah. So incredible.
He's just an amazing talent and a great kid too. So he's been with us almost all of these sessions. I think 4 out of the 5. One of them he had to do some AP exams, so I'll give him a pass on that. So we'll try to keep him busy. That's just great to have it. And thank you to Rachel and Derek, his parents, for everything they do, and for his grandmother Connie for pushing him when he probably didn't want it. And of course, I got to thank my mom for everything she did to make me play piano when I really didn't want to do it. It's tough when you're a teenage boy. I actually quit when I was Noah's age, but I came back to it thankfully. So great to hear, Noah. And if you wanted to make a donation to AmiciMusic for when I'm playing, we'd love to have it. It's been a tough time for live music in the past couple months, but we're keeping trying to play as much as we can. And in fact, this Thursday night, I hope you can join us. We're doing a 2-piano live stream concert. Myself and Daniel Lau, a fantastic pianist here in Baltimore. We were at Peabody Conservatory about 20 years ago together. We got a great program. Mozart, Rachmaninoff, Arensky, Guastavino, who's a great Argentinian composer, a little Bizet, a little Cole Porter as well. That's Thursday at 7:30. You can check out the AmiciMusic.org website for the link to that stream if you need it. That's a free concert, but again, any donation you want to make to AmiciMusic, we would be really glad to have it. All right, I got to get going because I'm going to go on for 8 hours here, but I got a couple more pieces I want to play before I get to Gershwin. Joplin had a kind of tough life himself. As my brother said, this should be called The Horrible Stories of the Crazy Composers, and Joplin was one of those. He had got married in Sedalia to a woman named Belle Hayden. They had one child together, but the child dies, I think, at about the age of 1 or 2, right around the time that Joplin finds out he has syphilis from all the years that he spent in these saloons. His wife leaves him at that point. We don't know what happens to her. And he then heads off to St. Louis again, and he meets up with a woman named Freddie Alexander, who he falls madly in love with. And they get married. And then 10 days after their marriage, she dies of pneumonia. Maybe got it during the wedding. So he goes into a deep funk for the next year. And the first piece that he writes after this is a piece called Bethena, a concert waltz. It's not even really ragtime. Ragtime always is in 2 beats, like a march. This is a waltz in 3, but it has that ragtime feel, and it shows that Joplin really thought of himself not just as a ragtime composer, but as a true classical composer, doing the folk music of America, but in a wonderful way. And this takes up the waltz form. It's a gorgeous piece. It was lost for many years, and only in the revival of ragtime in the 1970s did they find it again. Here's Bethena, a concert waltz by Joplin, written in 1905. Wonderful work, and it shows that Joplin was much more than just a ragtime composer, and he really had hopes that he had written an opera called Tremonisha, which he was unable to get performed. There was one piano-only concert that he did in Harlem in 1916, and it was not a great show. People did not go for it, and soon after, Joplin had a nervous breakdown, and he ended up living his the last year or so in a Manhattan State mental asylum, and he dies in 1917 from syphilitic dementia, buried in a pauper's grave that was unmarked for 57 years. But then, when The Sting came out in 1974, he won, his music won the Best Picture of the Oscars, and then he gets a Pulitzer Prize for Tremonisha in 1976. 50 years too late, but he actually always said that. He said that he would be famous 50 years after he died, and he was absolutely correct. Now, ragtime kept going, although it started moving away into the cities and into white America. It was in the Midwest. There were a lot of women composers in the Midwest, and especially into New York, into the big cities. And there was a lot of fear amongst a lot of the white people that the world was coming to an end. It sort of feels a little bit like today, that some of the things that are going on. Here's a review, a story in the Musical Digest of 1915 talking about ragtime music. It says, "The counters of our music stores are now loaded with this virulent poison, which in the form of a malarious epidemic is finding its way into the homes and brains of our youth to such an extent as to arouse one's suspicions of their sanity. This is an evil music that has crept into our homes and the hearts of our people and must be wiped out, as other bad and dangerous epidemics have been. A person once inoculated with the ragtime fever is like one addicted to strong drink. Ragtime is syncopation gone mad, and its victims, in my opinion, can only be treated successfully like a dog with rabies." So there was a lot of fear. It's all the same thing that happened with rock and roll and with rap music as well. Anytime a little bit of that black culture seeps in there, there are some religious and racist overtones to the responses. There's one great response from Igor Stravinsky, the Russian composer. He said, "I know little about American music except that of ragtime, but I consider that unrivaled. It's veritable art, and I can never get enough of it to satisfy me. I am convinced of the absolute truth of utterance in that form of American art. God forbid that you Americans should ever compose symphonies and fugues." A little backhanded comment there. But I wanted to finish one last ragtime piece. Many of you heard Noah last week play Rachmaninoff's very famous C-sharp prelude, which goes like this. Very famous, and he had to play that at all his concerts. And there was a concert he played at Carnegie Hall in 1917. And in the audience was a famous ragtime composer named George Cobb, who was known for taking famous tunes and turning them into ragtime. He did one for the Peer Gynt suite that I played by Grieg, and it caused a scandal in Norway. They thought they were desecrating their national hero. He called it Peter Gink, but it's very funny. And so he was at that concert and apparently went to a restaurant afterwards, and his friend dared him to do a ragtime version of the C-sharp minor prelude, and he apparently started playing what would become his Russian rag. It turns out Rachmaninoff was in the restaurant as well, and after Cobb finished, he apparently went up to Cobb and he said, "It's a nice melody, but you've got the rhythm all wrong." But I think in the end, he kind of liked this. So I wanted to just play the Russian Rag by George Cobb from 1918. Russian rag. All right, so at long last, we have reached our last piece, and it's a long one, so hopefully you can sit still for another 15 minutes or so, but it's the great Gershwin Rhapsody in Blue. I wanted to finish that, and I want to thank you all for being a part of this whole long episode of concerts, giving me a chance to bring out all the great solo piano music, and maybe we'll redo it again at some point, but definitely will be some other programs in the future I hope you will join me with. Gershwin was born in 1898. Jakob Gershowitz was original his name. His father had come over from Russia, and he was his older brother Ira was the smart kid in the family, but poor George was kind of the roller skating hoodlum. He was out with the hoodlum crowd, didn't do well in school, but ultimately his parents got a piano when he was about 12 years old. He had watched the player piano at his friend's house and had learned how to play just by watching the keys go down. He ended up getting piano lessons. He becomes the youngest song plugger on Tin Pan Alley, plugging some horrible songs in 1916. Soon after, he writes his first song and has a great title. It's called When You Want 'Em, You Can't Get 'Em. When You Got 'Em, You Don't Want 'Em. It was not a big seller, but it was his first song. He then followed that up with Swanee. That made quite a lot of money, and when Al Jolson took it up, and that got him connected to Paul Whiteman, who was doing some really cool jazz band stuff in the early 1920s. Gershwin began to play with the Paul Whiteman Band, and Whiteman had a dream that he would be able to put on a concert in a concert hall and to show that jazz was like a real was real music. And so he told George he would love him to write a piece for him if that ever happened. George said, okay. Well, the story goes that in January of 1924, George and Ira are playing some pool, and they happen to look in the newspaper. They an advertisement for a concert by the Paul Whiteman Band at the Aeolian Hall, and it's going to feature a great new work by a young George Gershwin. Now, Gershwin did not have any great new work, so he called up Whiteman. He said, I can't write a book. And he said, and Whiteman said, you've got 5 weeks. You got to do this for me. And that is the genesis of the great Rhapsody in Blue. If I could find the rest of my thing here. Here it is. Soon after, Gershwin was on a train up to Boston, and it was on that train where the inspiration came to him. He said, it was on that train with its steely rhythms, its rattly bang, that is often so stimulating to a composer. I frequently hear music in the very heart of that noise. And there I suddenly heard, and I even saw on paper, the complete construction of the Rhapsody from beginning to end. I heard it as a sort of musical kaleidoscope of America, of our vast melting pot, our unduplicated national pep, our metropolitan madness. By the time I reached Boston, I had a definite plot of that piece. So he gets back to New York and he feverishly writes it out. Ferde Grofe, the band arranger for the Paul Whiteman Band, basically lives with him. They churn out this music. It was actually going to be called American Rhapsody for most of the time, but then Ira came up with the title Rhapsody in Blue after he had visited an art exhibit at the Metropolitan Museum, paintings by Whistler. And if you know Whistler's paintings, Nocturne in Black or Symphony in White, that inspired Ira to come up with the title Rhapsody in Blue, playing off on the blues as well. A brilliant title. The famous slow theme, which is now the United Airlines commercial, that only came in about 2 days before the show. Gershwin realized he needed to have some sort of contrasting elements rather than the fast music. So that came up suddenly. And in fact, much of the piano solo part, this was for piano and jazz band, was improvised by Gershwin at the concert. He didn't even know what he was going to play. And he just told Whiteman he would nod to him when it was time for him to come in. And this was a really important concert. The who's who of people were there. John Philip Sousa was there. Leopold Godowsky, Fritz Kreisler, Jascha Heifetz, Sergei Rachmaninoff, Igor Stravinsky, Victor Herbert. It was a who's who. They really wanted to see if jazz could make it. And Paul Whiteman himself was really nervous about it. He said, 15 minutes before the concert was to begin, I yielded to a nervous longing to see for myself what was happening out front. So I put an overcoat over my concert clothes and I slipped around the entrance of Aeolian Hall. There I gazed upon a picture that should have imparted new vigor to my willing confidence. It was snowing, but men and women were fighting to get in the door, pulling and mauling each other as they sometimes do at a baseball game or a prize fight or in the subway. Such was my state of mind by this time that I wondered if I had actually come to the right entrance. Then I saw Victor Herbert going in. It was the right entrance, sure enough. The next day, the ticket office people said they could have sold out the house 10 times over. I went backstage again, more scared than ever. Black fear possessed me. I paced the floor, I gnawed my thumbs. I vowed I would give $5,000 if we could stop right then and there. Now that the audience had come, perhaps I really had nothing to offer them at all. Finally, there was no longer any way of postponing the evil moment. The curtain went up, and before I could dash forth, as I was tempted to do, and announce there would not be a concert, we were in the midst of it. And Gershwin's piece came very much towards the end. I think it was the second to last piece. And when Ross Gorman did that beautiful klezmer kind of slide up to begin with it, just a fascinating, great moment, people sat down and they knew they were in for something special. And Paul Whiteman wrote about this. He said, "Somewhere in the middle of that score, I began to cry. When I came to myself, I was 11 pages along. To this day, I cannot tell you how I conducted that far." So it's a masterful work. I'm just going to do a solo version, Rhapsody in Blue by George Gershwin. I've been here almost 2 hours. I hope you've had a great time. I've enjoyed playing all this fantastic music, bringing us all the way from Bach to Gershwin. Again, if you're able to make a donation to AmiciMusic, please go to AmiciMusic.org and make the donation there. We really appreciate it. Thank you all. Thank you to Sally Sparks for producing this. Thank you to Noah Teeny for all of his great piano playing. And thank all of you for keeping music alive. And I hope you'll tune in this Thursday night, 7:30 p.m. Go to AmiciMusic to get the exact link for that. It's a stream that you can get to on Thursday night. Fantastic piano music. I hope you'll be there. Thank you again. I'm going to take a shower, and I'll see you soon. Take care.